The dead part of the Cardinals offseason is almost over, and we have our good friend Jeff Jones of the Belleville News-Democrat on to talk today about Cardinals offseason, kind of preview some things that are going on, maybe some thoughts on the World Series, and as we're all anticipating what should be an interesting and different winter on this episode of Deal on the Card. Welcome into Deal on the Cards. See the first time, Josh and Sandy, as always. Andrew will jump in here at some point as well. Cardinals podcast. We go live twice a week over here on the YouTube channel. And today we're joined by Jeff Jones. Jeff, I always appreciate your time. And I just want to kind of, as we jump in, like, what does October look like for you when the Cardinals have basically nothing going on? The rest of the baseball world's kind of moving a little bit. But what does your October look like during a season like this?
Yeah, the good news is that you found me at a time when I'm doing nothing, when I have just like everything in the world open to me to do. No, watching the World Series, right? Watching a lot of baseball, finding myself low-key disappointed in the Milwaukee Brewers because if they had been in the World Series, I would have been at the World Series, so that would have been a good time for sure.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's trying to stay on top of the things that need to be stayed on top of. It's dealing with. Sorry, I just realized there's a ton of light coming in I'm in my basement and we're coming in a window here. There's a lot of stuff going on just in terms of what, we got the notes about the offseason surgeries and what have you. We're sort of prepping for the start of the free agent market here in a couple of days and just in looking at what that lay of the land stuff is like. It's been quiet thus far. I expect it to continue to be quiet here for a little bit. And we'll see if the real business gets kicked off round about the GM meetings.
Yeah. So speaking of the World Series, I mean, Blue Jays up as we're recording 3-2 now. Like, is this how you thought things would go down so far? I mean, I was in the Dodgers in 6, hopefully not 5 camp before this, and I mean their offense is just not shown up.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, there was a party that was concerned that if the Dodgers went out and just blew the Blue Jays off the field, that it would make for a really long winter of discussing a lot of the stuff that's going on around baseball. And that's going to be, unfortunately, I think, super prominent over the next year and a half or so. Yeah. So the fact that no matter what happens from here, it at least has been like a competitive, compelling series is a plus. I think that the Dodgers have roughly the same flaws that we all sort of expected that they would, right? That most of the bullpen is not very good, and that a lot of their veteran offensive guys just haven't really been able to tune it up thus far. They're really not getting a lot. It's outside of Ohtani, the offense is just really not there. And the Blue Jays have been able to kind of take advantage of that. They're that's a good team with a lot of talented guys on it. And then I wrote about this sort of at the outset of the series, they just spent $500 million on a player, and they signed George Springer, and they signed Barrios when they signed him, right? The Blue Jays are not averse to throwing the weight of Rodgers around. This is not some sort of David and Goliath type of deal. That's a good team with a lot of good players on it, and they're showing out.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a really fun series. I'm just glad it hasn't been a Dodgers sweep. Like Josh, I kind of worried about that. But moving to some front office stuff going on with the Cardinals, Chaim officially took over at the end of September. What's your overall read of Bloom so far, and what do you think his goals are for the organization?
I think those. I think that what he really wants to be able to do is to build a program kind of in the image that he was not able to do in either Tampa or Boston, because there are resource limitations that exist in Tampa that do not, or at least ought not, exist here. And there were a lot of other things happening in Boston. Some of it had to do with resource limitations, which were even more egregious, arguably, there than they were in Tampa, but also just sort of the direction from ownership and the way that those folks are very active in the baseball operations in that team that I think interfered with a lot of what he would have wanted to do. I think that it's really sort of difficult to see what that looks like in terms of operational stuff from here moving forward. I think that we have already seen some very small indications of what that is. For example, I think that the willingness to kind of reverse course is too strong, but the willingness to not just sort of shuffle Ivan Herrera into the outfield in the way that we all kind of thought was going to happen seems to be an indication of a little bit of a different line of thinking. I think that we have already seen some of the, in some of the roster choices and some of the guys they have. And I'm really interested to see what it looks like when it gets down to be non-tender time and 40-man time and all of that kind of stuff, because there are a lot of guys. I mean, I could count up to a dozen guys that need to go on the 40 this winter who I could make a case for going on, right? And so that is going to be an opportunity to learn a lot about the way that he wants to run this team, at least in the short term.
Yeah. It seems like the Cardinals are avoiding the word rebuild with this, but like, I mean, I don't think Chaim's been super adverse to it. And it feels like that's the direction they're heading in. So curious if you agree with that, one, and two, on their premise, what do you think a Chaim Bloom rebuild looks like? Because not all, I feel like when someone says rebuild, everyone has an idea of what that means, but I don't think all rebuilds are created equal.
No, and I don't imagine this being a rebuild where they yank it down to 62 wins and they think that they're drafting in the top 5 3 consecutive years, partially because the lottery rules make that hard to do, but also partially because I do think they were sincerely spooked by kind of the dropout in fan support last season. I don't think they really anticipated that it would get as bad as it did. I mean, I can remember having a lot of conversations, even as recently as early in the 24 season. They're like, well, the attendance is going to dip, but it's hard to imagine it ever getting below 30,000. And it was below 20 for, I'd have to count a dozen or so games in 2025. And that's like, that I think really shook them up in ways that they were not anticipating necessarily. And so, that coupled with, it is still the NL Central, right? Like, I think the one lesson that we learned from these playoffs is that, the Brewers actually were fake. The Brewers and Cubs both just got to play the Central a lot this season and looked really dominant in that way. So, there isn't really a necessity to bottom it out because this is not a division where you don't have to build that kind of team to stay competitive, and they can be competitive even with the guys they have in-house.
So I'm curious along with that line of thinking. There's some quotes that DeWitt's gave to the Post-Dispatch about like the Phillies and some of the parallels there about how they had to kind of figure things out too. And I don't think anyone's expecting them to go full Phillies mode where they're spending out the wazoo like Dave Dombrowski does. But do you think there's anything when you talk about they're getting spooked a little bit about the fan response that they do see, okay, we need to rebuild the core and build the foundation again, but at some point we have to reinvest and bring those quote unquote stars in and bring that interest in from bigger moves that fans seem to clamor for, but it doesn't seem like obviously the near term future. But do you see like a thought process in there, and that if we just try to Tampa Bay raise this, like that's not going to be good enough?
Yeah, I do think there is something to that. I think that starts primarily with extending the guys that they hope are worthy of the extensions, right? Whether Mason Wynn is first in line for that, whether JJ Weatherholt is first in line for that, I think is a real possibility. I think that is probably where it starts. And if I had to guess, where they might flex, it might be in that area. I do think too that you might see a little bit, they might be more inclined to start bringing in actual current, like be one of these teams that jump on guys who maybe don't have the market that materializes for them, right? For example, let's say Dylan Cease does not have a market that looks like he wants it to look like. Maybe they're a team that jumps in at that like 1 year, that Bueller type deal where it's like 1 in 28 or something. That's just as a for instance, right? And becomes a team that flips that guy and then looks at it. These are things they can do that at least are like short-term interest drivers that don't hurt a long-term plan.
Yeah, there's a ton to talk about with the free agent market. I just want to jump back to attendance real quick before we move on from that. The Cardinals have been bad before, right? But the fans have really never responded the way they responded this year. It seemed kind of crazy. I mean, the 2016 through 2018 teams, like they were frustrating. The Cardinals had clear flaws. They missed the playoffs 3 years in a row, just like they did this time around. What was different for fans? Why do you think fans, for the first time ever, like really stopped coming to the ballpark? I mean, you had below 50% capacity, like you said, for several dozen games at the end of the season for a team that was in contention for a lot of the year. So what do you think is the big difference here? And does moving on from Mo fix that?
So I think part of it is that this is the first time 23 accepted and 23 was a surprise, right? There was no anticipation that 23 was going to be as bad as it was. This was the first time post-pandemic that they have had a year like this. And I do think that there is a percentage of people who their viewing habits just got different throughout, they got used to not going to games and it became less of a central part of their day to day. I think that the fact that, as positive as it is that you can just sort of a la carte buy the streaming service and watch the games in the market, the fact that it's not as simple as just turn on the TV and the game is on, I think does cut down on the way that some people do consume the game. I think that is a part of it as well. But I also think that the messaging last winter was like really bad. It was like aggressively bad. It was like, we're going to get through the winter and we're going to sort of see what it looks like. And we're going to give guys some, like, to give guys runway is to say, we're not going to do anything. These are the guys that we got, and this is going to be what it is. Right. And on top of that, to go into the winter and say, look, we're going to trade this guy, this very famous Hall of Fame guy we're doing it. We're shipping him out of here. And it at least creates, okay, look, if that's going to sting, but maybe they'll bring in some guys and it'll look like progress and it'll look like a plan. And then they just didn't do it. They just couldn't get it done. They couldn't get the ball across, whoever's fault it was, they just couldn't get it done. And so it looks like a winter where, like, I mean, they did nothing, right? Like, they signed Phil Maton on March 7th or whatever, and that was it. Like, there wasn't even like just dump Nolan Gorman there was nothing. There wasn't Richie Palacios for Andrew Kittredge. Like, it was just, and so it just created this zero expectation summer where everyone, and I think it didn't help them that there was a very clear expiration date on the front office, right? It had a very big sense of, we just got to suffer through one more of these and then they'll be back. And so why would you go to the ballpark under those circumstances if you weren't a person who was like really dug in on it day in, day out?
Yeah, and moving back to the front office point and the transition, they just announced that they're adding more front office roles this offseason, and they announced an expansion of the scouting department as well. What do you think this says about where the front office was at before with Mo, and what do you think these additions will do for Bloom's regime?
So I think in part it is reflective of them having less of a focus on international scouting than they probably should have had. I think that they have been active in the international market, but I think somewhat famously, they have never really played in the top end of that market, right? They have always been in the sort of like more projectable, we'll take some risks, but it's going to be guys with higher floors type of deal. Has always been closer to where they've played. They've spent money on some guys, but they have not spent that like crazy top of the market money on guys. And so I do wonder if ramping that up makes them more comfortable doing that. I think it is also reflective of kind of where some of the priorities are in player development, right? Because to develop players, you have to be able to acquire players, and it is cheaper to sign international free agents than it is to sign whatever major league free agents or to try to trade assets for guys. If you can, as bad as the labor market is, if you can sign a crap load of 16-year-olds and shake a couple of them out, then you're going to develop more talent that way. I also think that it is probably some look ahead to what the next CBA is going to look like, because if they are expecting there to be, whether they're expecting a cap or whether they're expecting to be some sort of significant changes in terms of like international player acquisition, i.e. an international draft of some sort, then getting ahead of that probably puts them in a slightly better position to be able to, be ahead of that game if that is how it kind of unfolds.
Yeah, just one more quick question about the front office here. Since Bloom took over, it's been pretty quiet. We haven't really seen a lot of people let go. Do you think that changes this offseason? Are we going to see some bigger transitions? And if not, what do you think Bloom's thoughts and feelings are towards the members of Mo's former regime?
So I think that a lot of what we have, I think that the short answer is no. I think that they've probably already done most of their heavy lifting. They're going to hire an international scouting director. They might shuffle a couple of folks around and let those sorts of things happen. But I think that the principles are going to stay in place, and that, that was something that Bloom said the day that he took over, and that has sort of been reinforced throughout the winter, is those folks are going to stay in place. Now, part of that might depend on what other jobs look like, right? Like, I have seen no indication that any of the AGMs here have interviewed for jobs elsewhere. The Colorado job was one that I was curious about, just in terms of Mozeliak having a connection to ownership there, and Randy Flores maybe being a guy who would make sense as a guy who could run the Rockies in theory, right? But I think there was reporting, I think last week, that they're down to it's Emil Solade, and I forget who the second guy was, but it's a couple of guys who are not Cardinals guys, who were kind of the two finalists for that job. And so I think that he's willing to kind of work within the parameters of what's here. I think that of the way that the structure kind of existed previously, I think it is interesting that it seems like Chaim and Moises Rodriguez have been relatively close here over the last year, especially in terms of player development, which is not to say that like Moises was like he was obviously a big part of the conversation previously with Mozeliak, right? But I think that a lot of us who are around constantly would have said that Flo was sort of closer maybe to the decision-making matrix there than Moises had been, and I'm not entirely certain that is still the case. I think it is also worth noting that, like, all joking aside, I believe there's an expectation that Mike Gersh is going to stay in the organization in that same special projects role, which like is indicative of him. Like that is a job that he is good at, right? Like the ability to sort of analyze those things and break them down, if not maybe the public facing part of that. And so I think that there is a lot of trust that's been built up over the last year. And part of that is what happens when he has whatever it's, really 2 years to onboard. It creates a better opportunity to build those relationships. He joked on that first day that he didn't have to go around and ask everyone what their name was and like where the copy machines were. But there really is one of the other things that comes out of that is having that familiarity and building trust. Whereas, if you're coming into an organization cold on day one and you don't know anyone, then the instinct is going to be to fire everyone and bring in your guys. And that's going to be less of the case if you've already worked with them for the 2 previous years, at least in some capacity.
I don't know if this is fair to say or not, but just as you're kind of describing that, it feels like his perceptions, they have the right people to pull this off, but it's just maybe not been done the right way, or they're not in the right roles, or I don't know what does that say, I guess, maybe about the final years of Mozeliak's leadership then, for Bloom to come in and be like, actually, we do have the right people in place. It's just this hasn't necessarily been led in the right direction. I don't know how you would put words to that, but do you think there's something there with that?
So I would say that the biggest sort of rot was on the player development side, especially domestically, in terms of the way that maybe some of the affiliates were not properly staffed in the right way. I think in terms of some of the direction that was coming from the top of that department, I think that a big part, like for all the changes that are not being made this winter, Rob Cerfolio replacing Gary LaRocque last winter is one that should not go unnoticed, right? That is a significant change. I think Matt Pierpont's voice has been significant, substantial over the first year of him working in the organization, which is part of why they're going to look to hire basically a hitting version of that guy, which amusingly is pretty much like more or less what Jeff Albert is doing with the Mets right now, though I think he's going to be in uniform. But that's what they are looking to do with the guys that they have. And really it's just a matter of, I think you're right. I think that there is a degree of this. Some of this stuff does exist in-house. Is it being used properly? I know that there has been some frustration kind of throughout the organization in terms of like, they spend all this money, like buying the tech and buying the sensors and all the stuff that you need. And do they have enough people to literally go from affiliate to affiliate and teach people, like teach coaches to use it? Did they have coaches at every affiliate who were as bought in as they should have been in integrating this stuff day to day? Or did some of those folks just like literally not have the time in their day to coach and also try to do all this other stuff? And that's what hiring the support staff is about, in theory, is to make that burden a little more spread out and optimize, I guess, is what we would say, what those guys are doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. That's super helpful. Well, before we jump in on some questions about the coaching staff and roster, I want to thank a couple of our sponsors real quick. And as always, we're presented by 314 Sports Cards and Collectibles. They're located at 9640 Olive Boulevard and all event. Open 10 to 5 Monday through Friday and 10 to 4 on Saturdays and Sundays. They buy, sell, and trade all sports cards and Pokemon cards. You get the new selections of packs, boxes, and single cards that you're looking for in their store all around the week. Make sure you go check them out. We know many of you shop there already and love them. And so make sure you tell them we told you to check them out. And also want to tell you about our other sponsor, and that's Underdog Sports. The Deal on the Cards podcast is proud to be partnered with Underdog Sports, our favorite place to play fantasy games. You're now eligible to play in Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and 37 other U.S. states. You got to check out Pick'em. It's so easy to play. You just pick 2 to 8 stats of your favorite players and choose whether they'll go higher or lower. You can win 20 times your money by going 5 for 5. If that sounds like fun, sign up with our promo code CARDS to claim your first free pick plus first time deposit offer up to $1,000 in bonus cash. We can't wait to see your entries. So, Jeff, in a similar line of thinking, like we talked about the front office, but there's also been cohesion and it looks like a path continuing forward with the coaching staff as well. A lot of fans obviously are frustrated with Ollie Marmol, and I feel like maybe there's been a little bit of a tide shift this year with maybe some people being a little bit more like, oh, maybe we can get around him. But were you at all surprised that Bloom kept Marmol in place? And building upon that, how important do you think the 2026 season is to Ollie's future in that role? Or do you feel like this is a natural long-term pairing in the making between him and Bloom?
Yeah, so I was 0% surprised that he stayed. I thought that the only way I thought that there would be a change would be if there was a candidate on the market that they felt like they would not get a second shot at, that they thought was obviously better. And like there are a number of people who have connections here who would have made sense, who came off the market, right? Like Skip Schumacher has a job in Texas. That was always kind of going to happen, I think.
Yeah.
That was sort of the deal when he took that job as the special assistant down there. Craig Albernaz is somebody that I had long wondered about because he has a connection with Bloom that goes way back into their days with the Rays, as well as having worked in Cleveland with Serfolio and some of those guys. And that's obviously an organization that folks cop from. And Derek Shelton, too. Derek Shelton's a guy who has that Rays connection also. He's a local guy. He's well respected around here. And he's also really close with Marmol. And I thought that probably if he did not get that Twins job, that he was likely to end up on the coaching staff here in some form or fashion. In fact, I don't think it's probably necessarily a giant coincidence that Shelton takes the Twins job yesterday, and then as of this morning, we have reporting about what the kind of the plans for the coaching staff is going to look like. Right, I think those things happened at roughly the same time. All of that said, I have been, I guess, a little surprised that there was not more outside influence under the coaching staff, not because necessarily I think they like had to be. It just is a natural thing that you would expect to see happen, to see some turnover in the coaches. The coaching staff in St. Louis has been relatively consistent. I know they like the hitting coaches and the pitching coach turned over, in the last 3-4 years it's been, but it has been a relatively stable system, right? And those were internal hires when they came in. Turner Ward was a promotion. Brant Brown was an outside hire, but BA stayed in place. All right, so there has been some consistency kind of throughout that system. So I think one way to look at it is that they are sort of happy with where that's going, and they're glad with the job that they did last year, working toward that sort of development end. The other less encouraging, more cynical way to look at it is that if they are not expecting a season in 2027, that they are probably not eager to get tied up in a bunch of multi-year coaching contracts that they're going to have to pay out if no baseball is being played. And that maybe there is something to keeping things in place until we get through whatever the other end of the labor issue turns out to be.
Yeah. So if you look at it through more the optimistic lens, then do you think there's a lot that Ollie needs to do? I mean, or I guess how could fans follow the progression of, because some of that stuff's just going to be behind the scenes, right? Especially if it's not a year where wins and losses matter, then you can't really grade them on that as per se. But how do fans kind of read the situation of like Ollie maybe is the guy in 2027 and beyond versus, because he at least as of right now still has just 1 year left in his contract. So they haven't done the extension yet. So I guess how confident are you? Do you think that maybe he is the guy that Bloom will end up tapping long-term as well? And they're just kind of waiting this out for now versus that 2026 really does have a big sway on how he gets to continue or not.
I guess what I would say is that I don't think that there is a lot he can do in 26 that would like help him, which is to say that I think they know kind of who he is, what he is capable of, and they are comfortable in those abilities, and they have a pretty good idea of how he's going to grow into the job, right? Like there always remains the possibility that something chaotic or bad will happen, and that you have to make a change, and that could be as simple as like if the bottom falls out and everyone gets hurt and they do win 58 games, then there probably just has to be. It's like there's just no way around it at that point. But I think that ultimately, for what he has been given and what he has been set up for and set up to do, it is hard for me to see a lot to argue with in terms of the way that like the day-to-day game management has gone on, right? Like I think that a lot of this is pure luck, and he has been the first person to say this when I've brought it up, but they went the entire year and didn't get a pitcher hurt. Like John King yanked an oblique, but they didn't have a single arm injury on the pitching staff the entire year after Zach Thompson got hurt in spring. And so that's hard to do unless you are very committed to stick to your usage plan and be willing to just sort of lead into that no matter what, right? That doesn't make for really satisfying games all of the time, and I'm sure creates a lot of frustration when it ends up being things like Ryan Fernandez gets walked up by Francisco Lindor in April because that's the guys that they had. But that is a commitment they made to keep those players healthy and to, sort of maintain the organization that way. And they stuck to it. And so from a management perspective, there is a lot to like about that. And I think especially if you are talking about a young team that is going to have a lot of guys on it who haven't really known another manager, then I think that there is really some logic into letting him kind of grow with that group.
And I think two guys that you didn't mention that have connections to the team that I'm sure fans are going to want are Albert Pujols and Yadier Molina. Do you think that fans are going to just continue wanting that to happen until, they take a job somewhere else? And then, like, what do you think is the chances that Albert or Yadi will ever manage the Cardinals or take a coaching role in St. Louis at this point?
I think that it looks, at least to me, fairly likely that Albert is going to end up getting the job in San Diego. It seems to be pointed that direction. I think he very clearly would have had the Angels job if not for the Artie Moreno of it all. And so, okay, then obviously, Albert is ready to manage and wants to do it. And if that's the case, then he's going to be an MLB manager. And if anything is, historically true in San Diego, like, if Albert is hired in San Diego, I would have to think that he is probably going to outlast AJ Preller in San Diego. But maybe not. Maybe, who knows what goes on there. And so maybe he becomes another person who's in the punch bowl here. With Yadier Molina, it's so hard to tell because, like, this is not the first time that Yadi has just, like, hopped on the gram and been like, I'm ready, let's do it. And then nothing happened, right? Like, he got one of those really good kind of cushy, mostly no-show jobs for a year and then just, like, literally didn't do anything for an entire season. I don't know that went over, like, awesome. I don't know that the little basketball vacation at the end of 22 has been entirely forgotten by everyone. Now, are the people who are making those decisions the people who are still frustrated by it? That is harder for me to say. I don't think it was so much in the dugout. I think there were some front office frustrations that happened, and they sort of felt like there was not a lot they could do about it, right? So I don't know. That relationship obviously is strong enough that he was able to be in uniform in the dugout last year for a couple of games, and I know everyone was very excited about that, and everyone made sure to say out loud that they were very excited about that. So I think that seems like a positive, but to me, it is so hard to tell with him because it is difficult to know if he's going to show up day to day. And that makes it really hard to commit to him for a job like that, because I think a lot of people don't want to live through Matt Holliday again, because I think that was kind of embarrassing for everyone. And that is probably not something that they are eager to repeat if it were to pop up.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a situation to monitor moving forward. Well, jumping over to the roster side of things, the Lars Nootbaar surgery certainly came as a surprise to some of us, and it really seems to change what their offseason plans could be. So what's your read on Nootbaar's status this offseason, and do you believe this makes it more likely that he stays with the team into next year?
I think it has to make it more likely that he stays, just because it is clearly a significant injury and a significant surgery with a big recovery. And that, as far as I can tell, like, and I have looked and I have asked around, there are not a lot of examples of this being a surgery that people have had before and returned to the big league. It's like the most prominent example is Yoenis Cespedes, who had that surgery and then stepped in a hole chasing a boar or whatever and broke his ankle, and then basically never came back. Like, he played whatever it was, like 5 games in 2020 and then quit and went home. So it's just like, it's sort of an unprecedented repair as far as I can tell. And there does come some risk with it, right? Like, the idea of the repair is to relieve some pain and also to decrease the possibility that you might tear an Achilles later, because it would abrade kind of against that bony buildup. The downside of that is that it is more susceptible to tearing during the recovery, which is what happened to John Wall when he had the surgery on one of his feet when he was playing for the Wizards, right? And so, who's to say? Now, the description from Bloom has been that they're not ruling out opening day. That, to me, doesn't sound like they're super confident that he is going to be available on opening day. It's like, if opening day is a maybe, then internally, does that mean April 15th? Does it mean May 1st? Does it mean Memorial Day? I don't know. I really have no idea. And unless they want to start talking about it, it's going to be pretty hard to find that out. I think that trading him becomes a real challenge, because you are going to be trading a player who has 2 more years of team control, including one that we know is going to be impacted by injury. And then the second one is going to likely be impacted by a labor dispute. And so if those are the 2 years of control that you have with that player, I don't really know what the return looks like. And if there is not a return that makes sense, then, maybe there's a universe where what makes sense for them is to get him back on the field, and if he plays well and if he shows healthy, then he's tradable at the deadline. Maybe that is probably the way that plays out from here, but I do think it makes it significantly less likely that he gets traded this winter unless there is a team that is both really into his skill set and very sure on the medicals, and that seems like a hard combination to find.
Yeah, it's unfortunate right now. When you mentioned Cespedes, I think the other guy that jumps to mind is Tulowitzki. I believe he had similar surgery to address bone spur growth.
Yeah.
And I dug into that a little bit, and it's not encouraging. I mean, it's crazy because with this surgery, right, it doesn't seem like something that should be so invasive. It's just bone spurs, just, growths on your heels. And yet it seems to be something that really derails people for a long time. Recovery is tough. Like you said, re-injury becomes a distinct possibility during that. I know with Tulowitzki, they thought it was going to be an 8-week timetable, and it ended up taking like 16 months to get him back to full strength. He was never the same player. So obviously we hope that's not the case with Lars.
Right.
We're going to have to look at that going forward. It's just scary,
Yeah, it is a significant injury. And that's going to be a real part of their winter and probably the start of next season.
I'm guessing this is something they didn't have. I mean, it sounds like based on the reporting, this came up after the season that he was recommended to do this, but this isn't something they had to read on midway. Okay. Yeah. So that,
it was his feet hurt sometimes, and that happens to a lot of guys, right? Like that's not an uncommon deal. And we all have sort of understood about, when the foot pain becomes a problem, that kind of kinetic chain, the swing doesn't look right and the running doesn't look right, et cetera, et cetera. But no, I think the substantial repair was a surprise to everyone.
Okay. So then I guess the follow-up question is, how do you think this impacts how they handle the left-handed bats this offseason? I think everyone kind of is under the impression they will probably move some of them, and Nootbaar was a guy that I feel like a lot of people thought could be that. So does this make it more likely that a Brendan Donovan, Alec Burleson, Nolan Gorman, or the guys, one of those or two of those guys are on the way out? Or do you think that was kind of already set in stone? Like, what is your read right now on how they're going to handle that clutter on the roster?
I do think that was already likely, even before the injury. I think that the Donovan situation, I think, is clearly pointed toward a trade this winter. I think when you look at a guy who, again, 2 years of team control, one of which is 27, and who knows, a guy who last winter, he had expressed some interest in an extension. That didn't happen, and now he's with a new agency. Usually when that happens, it is not indicative of a guy who is likely to stay. The other thing that I'm sure I've mentioned it before, but that I keep wanting to mention, and we'll see if it is relevant or not with new front office, because there are going to be things that change that we don't know. But the Cardinals have literally never gone to an arbitration hearing with a player and then extended that player into their free agency years. Michael Wacha is the only one they even walked to free agency. Everybody else either got traded or released or DFA'd before the end of that time, after having gone to a hearing. Now, maybe with a different front office, that's less relevant, but that is a pattern that has clearly materialized in the way that they have dealt with these guys. And so that's Donovan. That's also Nootbaar in terms of guys who they have gone to ARB hearings with. So, the other part of this, and I guess if you're a Cardinals fan, the quote unquote positive part of it is that they are going to need to open a spot for JJ Weatherholt. They are expecting him to be, he very well could make the team as of opening day. At a minimum, like, he is going to be in the big leagues next year for the majority of the season, right? And is going to need a spot, and that is probably just going to be second base. I think that he is probably playable at third, but it is not probably in everyone's best interest for that to be a long-term spot. Second seems much more like it, and so Donovan is the guy who definitely is the guy that's easier to move out. In terms of the other ones, Nolan Gorman, I think, struggled enough down the stretch that I think that they are approaching kind of the end of their rope with him in terms of being willing to be patient and being willing to wait that out. The challenge with Gorman, of course, is that he has like the one tool that you really don't have replicated anywhere else in the system. Like, the power tool is just so substantial, but if he just can't ever access it reliably, then again, eventually you run out of time to be willing to try that. And I think that as we kind of came down the stretch, there was a lot of conversation about, what did you all learn this year? What did you not learn? What do you still need to know? And when Gorman was brought up, the inference was always, we learned what we wanted to learn about Nolan Gorman, right? It was, or not what they wanted to learn, but they learned what they needed to learn about him. And it seems to be that he is just kind of like a fringy big leaguer with big power who maybe is just never going to make enough contact. Like in order to get to the contact, the power just seems to go away, is sort of where it was pointed. Maybe somebody else can fix that, but that I would not necessarily anticipate him being back next season either.
Yeah, so similarly to that, how about the veterans? What do you think will play out with each of them? Arenado, Sonny Gray, and Wilson Contreras. It seems like all of them are at least somewhat open to a move to varying degrees, Contreras probably being the least likely to do that. How likely do you think it is that those three are dealt, and what kind of return do you think the Cardinals are looking at when it comes to these guys?
So Arenado was going to get dealt. Now, I say that. I also said that the entirety of last winter, and then it didn't happen.
Fair.
Right? So what the hell do I know? But that I think has clearly reached the end of the line here for both team and player. A year of the deal and whatever 35 million of it fell off over the last year, so maybe that changes the reality of it. Nolan has been fairly upfront about understanding that he maybe needs to expand his list a little bit in order for that to happen, and so I do think that will happen this winter. In terms of the other two, the Gray fit is really interesting to me, and I don't have a really good gauge for what that value looks like, because this, it's a $40 million commitment for next season. It's 35 in salary, and it's $5 million to buy out the team option for 27. And so does he have a market for at 1 year and 40 million for teams that he would say yes to? Maybe. Like, I can come up with a couple of places that might make sense. San Francisco, I know, have been reported at the end of the season. Some of that was contingent on Bob Melvin, who no longer is there. So I don't know if the reality of that is still real. Is Atlanta a team that really wants to get back on the horse quickly? And if so, that maybe feels like a match. The trick with Sonny has kind of historically been his being a little persnickety about destination in terms of wanting to be close enough to his home. He's not unusual for Sonny, for instance, in the middle of a homestand to like travel home for 24 hours the day after a start, spend some time at home, and then come back. Right, those sorts of things are important to him, and it would not totally floor me if it's difficult to find a spot, but I think they will try. Wilson, I think, is going to be more of a pure baseball decision. I think that if there are teams that come to them with a package for Wilson Contreras that they believe that they just sort of can't turn down, then they're going to be willing to go to him and see what that looks like. I do think that probably Wilson, in fact, I know that Wilson is more amenable to it this winter than he was last winter, just because I do think last winter there was a little bit of a degree of like, you brought me in, you immediately took the catching away from me, then things went bad, and then now you're just trying to dump. I think that there was some resistance to the idea that they would just try to dump him after something unsuccessful. Now, after he has had the position change and he has been really successful at it, he had a really good offensive year, and I think a much better defensive year than they would have reasonably expected. Then maybe it changes the conversation, and if it's less, we're trying to get rid of you, and more, this team wants you, then maybe that makes Contreras a little more amenable to it than he would have been otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how all this goes. Let's talk payroll. So if the Cardinals are able to move on from Arenado, Gray, I think Contreras seems unlike. I love Contreras. I really hope he's still here on opening day. But how far do you think they can decrease their payroll here? Do you think that they can? I mean, they're probably not going to be able to move all of the money from any of these three, except maybe Wilson, depending on what the package is. But where do you think the payroll lands this year before any offseason moves and not accounting for any offseason surprises?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, because the payroll, like if you look at the FanGraphs page right now, they anticipate like 105, and that's the three veterans that we've been talking about account for 80 of that, and then everyone else is ARB eligible, and there are some of the ARB eligible guys who I would expect to be non-tenders, and guys who are sort of later in that process who are going to even take a couple million more off of that, right? And so if you told me they went in the next season with a sub $100 million payroll, I would not be stunned. That would be jarring, but it would also sort of fit where they're at with some of these guys in terms of where they're at in their career path. If you told me that they went in, like, I can imagine a scenario where their 26 payroll is half of their 28 payroll. That would not totally shock me. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily the most likely. I do think that we should expect them to sign, for instance, a veteran starting pitcher, and maybe that's somebody who is in the 8 to 12 range, right? Who tack some of that back on. Another Phil Maton, or literally just Phil Maton again. Maybe that is 4, 5, 6 million, right? Something like that. They could very easily spend 20 to 30 million in next year's salary money in free agency this year, just kind of on the margins, without really making a big change and still being in that 90 to 110 kind of pocket. They could be higher than that if they don't find a taker for Sonny Gray, and if they hang on to Contreras and they go add these players anyway, maybe it's closer to a 125, 130, 135 type of deal. My guess is that it probably will not be quite that high.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just one more thing here. If the payroll drops below $100 million, like you said, it's going to be jarring. You think there's a way for Bloom to cut payroll that dramatically while still creating the buy-in he wants from this fan base? How do you think fans react to that, where they're clearly frustrated? It's been a multi-year decline. 2023, very jarring, very upsetting to the fan base. It feels like it really turned a lot of people off, and then going through mediocrity twice in a row. Do you think there's a way for Bloom to foster that kind of buy-in without making a splash to put butts in seats?
It's going to be probably, but it's going to rely on them kind of leaning on the younger talent. It's going to be a lot of JJ Weatherholt front and center. It's going to be them hoping Victor Scott takes a step. It's going to be, does Jimmy Crooks pop, or does Quinn Matthews show up and he's a big league pitcher next season? Like there are ways to do it that I think would be acceptable, especially if they just sort of lean into like, these are the new guys, and they just sort of shove it all out there at once. But yeah, no doubt there are going to be some people who question it. Like, again, there are only 3 guys on the roster right now who have guaranteed big league salaries for next season, and they are trying to trade all 3 of them, right? Like that is the A's zone, not for the same reasons or with the same thing, but that is Athletics territory, and so it will be incumbent on them to not let that happen.
So you just as we kind of wrap up this conversation today, and I always appreciate your time. You had a great piece this week about some of the arms in the Cardinal system that could have a very similar rise like Matt Savanson did last year and impact the bullpen. So as you mentioned, some new faces and names that Cardinal fans should be interested in. I know the bullpen isn't the sexiest conversation in the world, but is there 1 or 2 names that stand out for you from the 3 that you had picked out that Cardinal fans should keep an eye on? Is that guy could end up having a bigger role in the bullpen next year, and we haven't seen them quite yet?
Yeah, Gastelum is the guy that stands out. That's the guy who has been kind of climbing up the prospect rankings and has been getting a lot of attention for sure. And the guy who has just like the one really funky pitch that nobody seems to be able to handle, right? It's if he's Tommy Kahnle, that's still super good and useful. If he just throws a billion changeups and slices through guys, that is a super useful reliever. There will probably be someone who shows up to spring, and good luck guessing who it is, who all of a sudden used to throw 95 and is now throwing 99 and 101. And oops, now this is a guy who's getting looks in big league games. Austin Love honestly really does interest me too, just in terms of a guy who is like older and more physically mature and kind of further along that path, and just got hurt, right? Just had Tommy John and got hurt and had a long path back from it. Came back as a reliever and just wiped everyone out, just threw a billion sliders and no one could really make contact with it. That is an effective reliever if that translates. It's a guy who's going to play next year at 26. So if he's going to move, he can move fast. And that would not shock me in the slightest.
Yeah, let's have some fun on our way out here. Do you have any predictions for the offseason? Maybe a couple ones that keep it a little in check, and then something off the wall. Do you think there's something interesting the Cardinals could do? I mean, you don't have to use any names, but it'd be kind of fun to throw something and see what sticks.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is I will not be shocked if they end up with a bigger name starter than you might expect, because that person's market does not materialize, right? If there is a starting pitcher out there who just the deal is just not there for whatever reason this winter, whether it's teams don't believe in it, whether there's whatever, they could easily be the team that's got like if you told me today that they were going to sign Framber Valdez and it was going to be 1 year and $28 million, I would go, okay. Like that would not be a thing that would totally blow my socks off, right? Like that would sort of fit some of what they're looking at, especially if Gray is a guy who gets traded. I guess what would be a really fun, interesting prediction? I will say one of Herrera, Pages, Crooks, and Bernal gets traded this winter.
Okay, that would be interesting.
Let's just because that is a lot of bodies. I
Yeah.
don't know that they want to go into next year with like Bernal and Crooks being the combination at Memphis. That's a tough spot for both of them.
Yeah.
I think that they're going to give Herrera every shot for that to work out behind the plate. That seems to be the case from here on out. And so is it Herrera and Crooks? And if that's the case, where does Pages fit? Is it Herrera and Pages? That's the simplest case. If that's the case, I would expect that probably Pozo is going to get outrighted here in the next couple of weeks, and then probably they would be happy to have him back on a minor league deal. They would be very happy for that to happen, and I think that he would be content with that as well. We'll see. If he's got a big league deal out there, obviously he'll take it. But sure, one of those four catchers, let's say, as the fun prediction, gets traded somewhere this winter.
That is a fun one. On the way out, just because I feel like we get this question all the time, we haven't asked people in a while, so I'm curious. Do you have any information or updates on like pitching lab information? I know it's something that's always kind of like out there and people have asked about, but like what the status of that is.
The status of it is that I think it's going to be up and running when the building is up and running. I know that the Cardinals this winter were having there was concern is not the right word, but there was definitely a little bit of scrambling in terms of like finding a facility for guys to go to because they physically could not get on campus for a big part of the winter. I'm not entirely sure if they can. I don't believe they can even still. I think it's going to be like kind of pushing up to spring training, like into January, February, before the building is even open for guys to use on there. I'm going to Florida like the third week of November. I might try to drive the 70 miles from Miami up there to take a peek at it, just to see if I can see what I can see up there. So that is I think all woven into the changes they're making to the complex down there. I hear they're great. I don't know. I know my patio is gone. I know that they're changing all of that workspace around there, and that thankfully when they let guys demo the locker room this time, they didn't have to then rebuild it.
That's so funny. Oh man. Well,
the
Jeff,
2022 Palm Beach Cardinals got to do some demo work that had to be immediately reversed because oops, they didn't have the permits.
Oh wow. If that doesn't just feel like how the last few years have been following this team, I don't know what is. So
it was quite something.
We always appreciate your time, and I know the chat does as well. So thanks for everything you brought to the show. We'll have to have you again on at some point this offseason, and just really appreciate your time. So thanks for joining us.
Happy to do it, guys, anytime.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for tuning in to Deal on the Cards. We'll be back on Sunday, but until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jeff.